Hello, and welcome to Section 2 of Chapter 28 of the American Pageant for U.S. History or AP U.S. History. We're talking about progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. Today we're talking about progressivism in the cities through earth control. So the big theme for progressivism is power to the people, helping the common man against all the deck that's stacked against them, big business and government. And it took many little micro steps or baby steps to kind of get to this full-fledged national movement. Largely spurred on by the appointment, or not the election, but the appointment of President Roosevelt. And so some of the earliest reforms on how to govern happened with cities. In 1900, there was a devastating, awful hurricane that hit Galveston, Texas, which Galveston was kind of a wild, pretty lawless town at that time. A lot of red light districts and gambling going on in the 1800s. This hurricane, though, sadly killed 8,000 people, leveled most of the city, and so it was a chance for Galveston to start fresh. And instead of doing things the way that they had always done, through the status quo, they decided to hire professionals. Instead of having elected people that maybe don't know anything about water systems or city planning or electrical systems, they brought in experts. And so they hired city managing, and they really meticulously planned the city and rebuilt it from the ground up. And it just showed what happens if you put people that know what they're doing in their job, they can do it much better. And so many cities kind of took up this mantle and began hiring city managers. And so you had an elected mayor who would handle the political business, but then actually running and administering the city was done by a professional. A city manager, they were experts, they were free from corruption, they're not elected to office, they get their job based on merit, and they're paid from the taxpayer dollars. Tom Johnson in Cleveland was a big reformer that kind of did a lot of things to clean up Cleveland and didn't apparently clean up the pollution in the lake, since it caught fire 7 times or something, a mistake by the lake. Robert La Follette, Fighting Bob that we talked about in the previous section, took control from corrupt corporations and returned it to the people. He fought for the working man and for the farmer. Public utilities. This is the time when public utilities, electric company, the gas company, you name it, were taken over by the government. Because they were so vital to life in America that people shouldn't be making profit off of this. And so the government took over the public utilities in a lot of places and put up electrical lines. That's socialism, isn't it? Shh, I'm telling you, this is America. The governor of California, Hiram Johnson, helped break the grip of the Southern Pacific Railroad on politics. And so you get these examples of, initially small government, cities, and then later on, states and larger cities taking back the power to the people from the corporations, from the corrupt political machines. For women were also heavily involved in progressives. Women formed clubs. They discussed and proposed solutions to societal problems. Women were at the forefront of trying to reform the nation. You get the Women's Trade Union League and the National Consumers League to reform to try to tackle some of the issues that are going on in this country. Florence Kelley, who we've talked about previously, led the National Consumers League and formed it in 1899. She pressured laws for safeguarding women and children in the workplace, that it should be safe for them. Don't put your hands there and get them cut off and things like that. And also that they have some sense of security while they're working. In some of the Supreme Court rulings in Mueller versus Oregon in 1908, it was constitutional to enact laws that specifically protected women factory workers. They could not be discriminated against. They couldn't be cast aside simply for being women. They could have necessary things to protect these women. Lochner versus New York in 1905 was another Supreme Court ruling against labor. It invalidated the 10-hour workday in New York, but a later ruling upheld it in 1917 to say that, workers should work 10 hours a day. And you're going, wow, that's a long time. I can't even sit through this, 10, 15-minute video too long without taking my Snapchat. I see you doing it. Get off your Snapchat. Let's go. Mary Harris Jones, or Mother Jones, was a patron saint of the workers, really, in this country. She fought for 50 years for workers' rights. She really renowned among miners and industrial workers for her passion to help the poor, to help the underprivileged, and those workers get a little bit more of everything. Better benefits, more pay, maybe a little less hours at work. So one example that just kind of shocked people that safety measures were needed was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. There was a fire that broke out in New York City. And these women who were working in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory were locked in their factory. And so they had no escape. 146 women workers died after being locked in. The doors were locked from the outside to keep them working, so they couldn't wander off and not produce what the owners wanted. And so many of them burned to death. Scores of them leapt to their deaths from up high, very high stories. And so people watched in horror as this building is on fire and women are leaping from the building, their hair aflame, and falling to their death. And it just kind of opened up the America's eyes that something needed to be done about work safety, about protecting women, about fire codes, not locking people in work so they can't slack off. So it led to a lot of states passing workmen's compensation laws that if you're hurt or injured on the job, there should be some compensation. They shouldn't just fire you. You should have some medical bills paid for. Also, regulations against sweatshops, like maybe heating and cooling is a good idea. Maybe don't lock people in their work. It's probably smart to do those things. Some other progressive women movements that we have, the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, or the WCTU, teamed up with the Anti-Saloon League to really combat what they saw, demon rum, as the number one ill of society, that most of the problems could be traced back to alcohol, broken families, crime, poverty, and so that was their cure-all. Their silver bullet for fixing American society in their mind was to ban alcohol. By 1914, this movement had grown so much it was very political. It was hard to get elected in a lot of places if you weren't, quote, a dry, meaning you were anti-alcohol. 1/2 of Americans and 3/4 of the land was dry. So half the population lived in a place you could not buy alcohol. And if you looked at the area, the actual, draw the map, 3/4 of the land was dry. And then ultimately you get the 18th Amendment, which was ratified to the Constitution in 1919, banning the sale, production, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol. That's one of the 4 progressive amendments. The way to remember that, by the way, a little clue is, when you're 18 years old, you're not allowed to go buy beer or alcohol in this country. But when you turn 21, you can if you choose to do so. The 18th Amendment in our country banned alcohol. 21st Amendment repealed it and brought alcohol back, but that's not until 1933. We'll talk about this noble experiment in the 1920s chapter. We'll come back to it. This is a shocking picture of many of the women that passed away in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. Just kind of graphic and kind of awful. It's just a terrible, terrible tragedy that happened to these young girls. There's President Roosevelt there. He believed in progressive reform. He was a man of the people. Even though he grew up privileged, even though he grew up pretty wealthy, he fought for the common man. He didn't think that anyone had a voice for them, and so he stood up for the commoners. His program was called the Square Deal. Now that means that everyone gets a square deal. It means everyone gets a fair shot. He wanted to control corporations. He wanted consumer protection, that the people that bought products, they should be at a fair price and they should be safe. He also wanted to conserve natural resources. That is, an avid outdoorsman. He wanted to make sure that natural resources were preserved for future generations, but not locked away in a museum to where you can't ever touch them. He thought that the outdoors should be used, that we should use those resources to help the economy, to people to enjoy. They shouldn't be just roped off, in some untouchable thing, but it should be smartly managed. To show his different style of leadership, in 1902, the United Mine Workers went on strike. And now, typically, in the 1800s, you had strikes, and that meant violence. Anarchists showed up, and there was bombs, or the government was set in, the army, or detectives, or they used an injunction to shut the strike down because it was stopping the mail carriers. But what happened is most Americans associated strikes with violence, and the government turned against them. They didn't side with the workers, they sided with big business, and people were pretty annoyed with it. Roosevelt shows a little different path. So the United Mine Workers go on strike. It hurts the economy. People are freezing in the winter of 1902, and it doesn't look good. And it's shutting down the economy because they're not mining coal at that time. The owners refuse to negotiate. The workers are refusing to back down. So Roosevelt just uses his presidential power, because it's not forbidden by the Constitution, even though it's not specifically granted by the Constitution. He threatens to use the army. Basically, you guys settle this, you sit down to arbitration, or I will run your mines with the army. It's your choice. We're going to get coal and we're going to get heat to these people's homes somehow. Because of this threat, arbitration came in, and it ended with a 10% pay raise for the workers and a 9-hour workday. So the workers won, and it's largely due to the president acting and not just sitting on his haunches and twiddling his thumbs and doing these things. He and Congress then created the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor to tackle such situations here in 1903. They handled the increased tension between capital and labor. Capital are the owners, the people with money. Labor are the workers. Just so you guys know those terms and all that good stuff. Oop, didn't come out. And so some things, he goes after corporations. He goes after trusts. Some early signs of trying to fix things. You have in 1903 the Elkins Act. It fined railroads that gave rebates and shippers that accepted them. That practice from the 1800s, like giving rebates to the big corporations, was done away with. The Hepburn Act in 1906 restricted free passes and expanded the Interstate Commerce Commission. Remember, members of the press and congressmen rode on the trains for free, so they weren't going to write anything bad about the trains. And so Roosevelt gets the name of Trust Buster. When you got a business and they're stealing people's money, who are you going to call? Trust Buster. So in 1902, he used laws, federal laws, instead of just breaking up a labor strike. He used laws to break up the Northern Securities Company, which is a railroad company. And so he broke up this monopoly because he felt that it was hurting the people. They were charging too much. They weren't being fair. Their business practices were putting other businesses out of operation. And so he went after them. And he broke up this company, and the Supreme Court upheld the suit in 1904. And so he gets this reputation of being a trust buster. In all, Roosevelt and the government takes out 25 indictments. That's legally summoning you to court. That's pronounced indictment right there. It's a weird word. Of trust. He went after Standard Oil. He went after the beef industry. He went after tobacco. However, he didn't think that all trusts were bad. There was good trust. There were bad trusts. The good ones, if they didn't cheat the people out and they provided a good service, he left them alone, like the telephone company. The telephone companies were left alone in the early 1900s because they did their job properly. Even though Roosevelt's called the trust buster, Taft actually took out more antitrust cases in only one term than Roosevelt in his not complete 2 terms, but most of 2 terms. And so he started the trend, and he's a little more likable. He's a little more charisma. The consumer. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. It's supposed to be a book about the plight of immigrants, Lithuanian immigrants, specifically in Chicago, and how difficult it was to live as an immigrant in the cities. I believe Roosevelt said that Upton Sinclair aimed for America's heart and hit him right in the stomach because it's just a gross book. It's nasty. It was published in 1906. It really showed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, the awful things that went in people's meat. I mean, dead rats and poison and rusty nails, and men are washing their hands in the water used for sausage after doing their business. It was just disgusting. And this book people thought was fiction, but Upton Sinclair did his homework. He went and researched this. He went to meatpacking factories in Chicago. Federal Commission called in, and they went and investigated and confirmed what he wrote about. And so because of this, they passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And then eventually it helps leads to the Food and Drug Administration. And then because American meat has such a high standard of inspection and thoroughness of cleanliness, more and more countries begin buying our meat. And so we're exporting meat products, and it helps the economy. And you know what? It's not nasty. It's not gross. I mean, hot dogs are still kind of nasty, but they're delicious, right? Here's some sausage making back in 1906. Listen, yummy. Daddy, would you like some sausage? Earth control. The Desert Land Act of 1887 sold dry land very cheaply on the condition the purchaser would irrigate the soil within 3 years. Probably not the best idea, given all the water issues we have today in some of these areas, but it did open up more land for settlement. You have the Forest Reserve Act of 1891, which authorized the president to set aside public forests as national parks and other reserves. This is all pre-Roosevelt, by the way. The Carey Act of 1894 distributed federal land to the states on the condition to be irrigated and settled. Once again, they're just trying to open up more land. And then Roosevelt himself is an avid outdoorsman. He convinced Congress to pass the Newlands Act of 1902, which authorized the government to use money from the sale of public lands in the western states to develop irrigation projects, once again to develop more farming. By 1900, Roosevelt set aside 125 million acres of land in federal reserves. This is a picture of him and John Muir. They were very close friends in terms of, they did disagree on how to use land. John Muir of the Sierra Club thought that things should be more preserved. Roosevelt wanted to use the land. So their friends, they did clash over the Hetchy Valley, which you're probably wondering what that is unless you're from San Francisco or the Northern California. Murr wanted this valley preserved. Roosevelt wanted to use it for the people. They're going to dam it up and use it for water for San Francisco and for the whole Bay Area. And so the controversy, their friendship really soured because of this. Eventually, the Hetchy Valley, they did dam it up. And it filled up, and it's still primarily the drinking water for San Francisco today. He did believe, Roosevelt, in the policy of multiple use resource management. He believed in sustainability. They used federal lands for recreation, for logging, for watershed protection, for cattle grazing. That the land should be preserved but used. It shouldn't be, like I said, some pristine, never touched by man, but it should be preserved for future resources, for people to use for the economy, and for people to use for outdoors for recreation. He did help create the Forest Service in 1905. He created the Bureau of Reclamation. And in all, he preserved 194 million acres, created 53 wildlife refuges, and 18 areas of special interest. Probably no president in our history was such an avid outdoorsman and set aside more land than President Roosevelt. This is a picture of some loggers in Washington in 1912. They, just kind of logging. They were clear cutting forests, and he wanted to manage it. Let's, cut down not every tree, and let's cut down maybe the older ones or the dying ones, and then also plant new ones. That's a really big tree there, isn't it? This is the Hetchy Valley here. That was controversial, that led to the souring of the friendship between President Roosevelt and John Mayer, and it's a very beautiful valley. And then they flooded this, and this is what it looks like today. There you go. You can see the waterfall. See the waterfall right here, this one, and there's one right here. And then we're going to look at the next picture, and look, they're still there. But that valley was flooded, and that is drinking water for San Francisco, which is among the most expensive places in the nation to live. We're going to stop there for today for this section. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know.